Good evening and welcome to our fourth What Makes It Great program of the season. We've got one more program in March, and it focuses on one of the most iconic pieces in the entire piano repertoire, Chopin's legendary B-flat minor piano sonata with the famous Funeral March. You know this one. Though the Funeral March might be the sonata's most famous movement, its finale is actually one of the most infamous movements ever written. Robert Schumann's review of this finale called it a mockery, unmelodic, and joyless, and said, quote, "Music it is not." It's truly an extraordinary sonata with an extraordinary finale that I promise will remain incomprehensible to you forever if you do not come to the program. So stay home at your peril. It should be a fantastic way to finish the season. Now, tonight's program focuses on Beethoven's 7th Symphony, surely one of the most famous symphonies ever written. Unlike so many of Beethoven's major works, which were initially received with a mixture of admiration, bewilderment, and incomprehension, Beethoven's 7th Symphony was an immediate hit, mostly having to do with timing. Though the piece was written between the fall of 1811 and the summer of 1812, it didn't receive its public premiere until December 8, 1813, only 6 months after the Duke of Wellington's stunning defeat of Napoleon's younger brother at the Battle of Victoria, and only 3 months after an even more stunning defeat of Napoleon himself at the Battle of Leipzig. Given the political excitement of the moment, it shouldn't be surprising that Beethoven's Wellington's Victory piece, written for the occasion for a huge orchestra and 194 cannon shots, would be seen as the major work on the program, with the Wiener Zeitung referring to the Beethoven 7th Symphony as, quote, merely a companion piece to the Battle Symphony. The review did, however, say that, quote, the symphony fully deserved the loud applause and exceptionally warm reception that greeted it, but that same reviewer called Wellington's Victory ingenious. Believe me, it is anything but ingenious. And said, quote, leads one to conclude without hesitation that there is no work equal to it in the whole realm of tone painting. So much for the Pastoral Symphony. Now, however, many critics had highly negative opinions, in addition to Carl Maria von Weber's famous comment that Beethoven was now ripe for the madhouse, and Karl Wieck's saying that it was the work of a drunkard. One critic said it was, quote, a true mixture of tragic, comic, serious, and trivial ideals which spring from one level to another without any connection and repeat themselves to excess. And a decade later, the London Harmonicum echoed this opinion and said, quote, often as we have heard this piece performed, we cannot yet discover any design in it, neither can we trace any connection in its parts. You know, the idea that Beethoven's works were disorganized and lacking in connection, the exact opposite of how we view these pieces today, is a recurring theme that critics return to over and over again throughout Beethoven's career. But how could they have gotten it so wrong? What is it that they were missing? And is it possible that we might still be missing something similar today in our own rehearing of these iconic works? Well, these questions are answered by the very opening measures of Beethoven's 7th Symphony. Now, beginning a symphony with a slow introduction to establish the seriousness of a work was by now anything but new. 11 of Haydn's 12 final symphonies begin with slow introductions, as do Beethoven's 1st, 2nd, and 4th symphonies. However, the 7th Symphony's slow introduction is not only the longest symphonic introduction that had ever been written, it's actually half as long as the entire movement, but it's radical in ways that completely dumbfounded contemporary critics. Since this introduction is a fantastic point of entry into the entire Beethoven revolution, and since it not only introduces the rest of the symphony, but many of the main themes of tonight's program, let's look closely to see how it works. Here's how the symphony begins. Now, I want you to listen closely, because I'm going to ask you to sing the first 4 measures on La after we play it. Here's the beginning of the 7th Symphony. Fantastic, yes. All right, now I want you to sing the melody of the first 4 measures on La. I'm going to play the first 2 notes, and then you continue on La. Here we go. Sing. Keep going. Not bad. By the way, I just want you to know you did way better than they did. I asked them to do the same thing, and they stopped after 3 notes. Don't feel bad, but the fact that you failed really goes to the heart of the Beethoven revolution. One of the things I'm going to come back to over and over again tonight is that Beethoven's music is ultimately about transformation. As I said in October, it's about becoming, not being. What often matters in the Beethoven piece is not what a theme sounds like when you first hear it, what it is to be, but rather what it can become as the piece progresses. Becoming, not being. You know, unlike Mozart's elegantly crafted, jewel-like aristocratic melodies that sound like they come from Tiffany's jewelers, Beethoven's themes sound like they come from Walmart. Everyday, ordinary stuff, often not even a melody, but simply a rhythm or a shape. The actual theme of that opening, which was why it's so difficult to sing, is really basically nothing more than a rhythm. It's what I call 4 slow notes. I'm going to play it, and then you clap the rhythm. Here's the opening oboe melody. 4 slow notes. Clap. No one rush. Now, for Beethoven, that rhythm is the theme, irrespective of the notes or intervals. Anything in that rhythm is connected. For now, for the first time, the intervals or the shape of a melody isn't what's important, but something much more fundamental, pure rhythm. Now, every piece of music creates its own world, and the opening 8 measures of this symphony are fundamentally creating a world of slow-moving notes. So suddenly, in the 9th measure, when we hear fast notes, what I'm going to call fast notes. As I said, it's important that you learn these technical terms. Fast notes. That's a new element and it's a new idea, but it's fundamentally a rhythm and not a melody. Now, it starts as a rising scale like this, and it alternates, if you now understand Beethoven's new rhythmic concept of connection, with a transformation of our opening. Our 4 opening notes, our 4 slow notes, now become 3 slow notes. Now, as I said, Beethoven's about transformation, not about what an idea is, but what it can become. And suddenly, after an enormous crescendo from one end of the dynamic spectrum, from pianissimo, to the other end of the dynamic spectrum, fortissimo, Beethoven not only transforms our 4 slow notes and our fast notes from pianissimo to fortissimo, he suddenly and shockingly combines the two. Suddenly, our little graceful oboe melody combines with our rising scale, transform fortissimo like this. From his first symphony to his 9th symphony, Beethoven loved to take initially soft ideas and replay them as loudly as possible. But this isn't simply about taking something you first whispered and shouting it for an effect. Anybody could do that. It's about discovering a possibility in an idea that was unthinkable when you first heard it. Like discovering a possibility in a person that was unimaginable when you first met them. That little delicate oboe melody and that graceful rising scale are not only reimagined fortissimo, but they're now combined and connected. Now, once you understand Beethoven's new concept of connection, you realize that this introduction is not, quote, disconnected and lacking in any perceptible design, as the critics contended. It's actually structured for the first time in music history like a complete sonata movement. You've just heard the first theme, a restatement fortissimo, and a transition to a new key. Now, just as if it were a sonata form movement, you now get a second theme in a second key, all within this introduction like this. Second theme, second key. They start as nothing, just a held note, insignificant. Suddenly they have life and start to become a melody. Now, after a development section, still within this introduction, and a return to that second theme as if Beethoven were writing an entire first movement, not an introduction to a first movement, we come to the passage that stunned audiences and led critics to question Beethoven's sanity. A passage that you, unlike Beethoven's contemporaries, are now in a position to understand for the first time. Now, to transition to vivace, to the main body of the movement, Beethoven stunningly reduces the entire piece to a single note, to nothing but 55 E's in a row, to pure rhythm and a demonstration of his completely new concept of rhythmic connection. Now, having shown us that the two main ideas of this introduction are what I called 4 slow notes and fast notes, he first demonstrates step by step on a single note that these two apparently different ideas are in fact connected. He starts with our fast notes, now not a rising scale, but a single note. That was the rhythm of our rising scale. He slows it to half speed, slows it to half speed again. Now, this is what Beethoven's all about. He reduces that now to our 4 slow notes, but on a single note. This is the opening melody, but now reduced to its prime form, like Cézanne looking at a landscape and seeing only geometric shapes. This is the opening 4 notes of the piece. And then he discovers if you take this and add a little upbeat and speed it up, you now have the germ of the entire main body of the movement. You are literally witnessing the connection of these ideas demonstrated to you like a mathematical axiom on a single note, like this. The fast note, half speed. Here we go, the original 4 slow notes. Add an upbeat. Speed it up. Vivace. Amazing moment. Now, that one rhythm, dump-a-dum, will become an unbelievable rhythmic obsession, and it's going to dominate the entire movement. Now, the first statement of that tune, as you just heard, was beautiful, soft, pastoral, with a melody in just one solo flute. But remember, transformation is what Beethoven is all about. And when that flute tune is repeated, it's completely transformed, fortissimo, by the entire orchestra, with screaming high horns thrillingly joining the tune, along with running 16th note accompaniment, while the trumpet and the timpani pound out the movements, dum-ba-dum, bum-ba-dum, bum, obsessive rhythm over and over again. Listen to this completely transformed version. Now becomes this. I mean, that's transformation. Bravo to the horns. Like the introduction, the main body of the movement also has a second theme, but it too is based on that obsessive dum-ba-dum, bum-ba-dum, bum-ba-dum rhythm, which takes on an endless variety of shapes, all linked, once you understand Beethoven, by rhythm. Here's the second theme of the movement. Reduced to 3 notes, then 1. That's core Beethoven, taking a musical idea, reducing it to only 3 notes, and then just 1 note. Half of Beethoven is reducing the world to bum. And that 1 note somehow has become the essence of the entire idea. It's no longer just a note, it's now an essence. Now, to end the exposition, that opening theme returns, but now it's reduced to just its first 2 measures in a round, kind of like row, row, row your boat. He takes the opening 4 bars of that melody, which went like this, keeps the first two measures and changes the end. Change. And makes a little round of it like this. Now only one bar. And a monster scale. 2 bars of silence, then back to the beginning to repeat the exposition. Now, as you just heard, to prepare to return to the opening and repeat the entire first part, the entire exposition, the strings rise up what I'm going to call a monster scale and horrifyingly stop one note short of resolution. How could he possibly stop there? The whole audience is going, resolve, 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 resolve. And then after 2 more horrifying bars of silence, we go back and we beautifully resolve the dissonance by going back to the opening repeated ease to begin the repeat. And we're so happy. Now, the entire exposition repeats. Beethoven does follow tradition in some respects, and we come to that same monster scale passage a second time, and that same horrifying 2-bar pause. Now, this time, Beethoven counts on you remembering how this resolved the first time, so he can brutally change direction the second time. So, one more time, this was the first time. Pause. Here's what happens the second time. Expect a nice moment. You know that poem Jabberwocky by Lewis Carroll? There's that moment after he's killed a Jabberwocky, he says he left it dead, and with its head he went galumphing back. I've always thought that's what galumphing would sound like. Now, unlike Mozart, who elegantly and seamlessly connects musical ideas as he moves from key to key, Beethoven, so to speak, shows us the plumbing. Nothing is hidden. Connections are man-made. They're visible on the surface. You can hear it all happen. You watch it happen. Connection in Beethoven's world is the result of human effort. Now, the development section in a Beethoven symphony is the heart of Beethoven's idea of transformation. And I'm just going to show you one example to give you a sense of how the whole thing works. One of the principal ways that Beethoven develops a musical idea, once it's been established in the listener's ear, is to reduce it to a kind of a core essence, just enough so that the listener can recognize its source, and then completely change the continuation. The first thing that Beethoven does in this development section is to keep just the first measure of the theme. Here was the original, remember? All he does is put it down low and keep just the first measure, and then adds a brand new 5-measure continuation that becomes a theme of yet a new round, another sophisticated version of Row, Row, Row Your Boat. Now here's the 6-measure version. The first measure comes from the theme, everything else is new. Here's what it sounds like in cellos and bass. All new. The violins have the exact same thing 2 bars later, higher like this. Now here are 5 overlapping entries of that round, each one beginning before the previous one finishes, beginning with the cellos and basses. See if you can hear all 5 entries. First, second viola, oboe, flute and bassoon. Now, though I don't want to spoil all the wonderful possibilities that Beethoven hears in this utterly simple material in the development section, I will say that one of the most distinctive features of Beethoven's heroic middle period style is huge, dramatic preparations for major compositional events. Put simply, Beethoven makes his audiences wait for significant arrivals and resolutions longer than any composer in history. And the tension that builds up in this development section as we wait for the return of the main theme is truly amazing. And when that main theme finally returns, the return is utterly heroic. For contrast, here one more time was the very first version, the non-heroic lead-in to the tune the first time. Lovely. Not heroic. Now, here's the heroic version to begin the recapitulation. This is what transformation is all about. Same exact material. That's what transformation's all about. Now, you can always clap for Beethoven. All the important material returns in the recapitulation, the third section of the movement, and the final section of the movement, the coda, begins with a kind of uniquely Beethovenian wit that completely depends on you remembering what happened with our monster scale the first 2 times around. So just in case you forgot, little reminder here. The first time we did this. We stopped on our dissonance, then we resolved by going back to the beginning. Second time, same scale, and then we galumphed. Here's what happens the third time to begin the coda. On the edge of your seat? That's Beethoven in a nutshell. Now, for the first time, the scale actually completes itself. But then, oh well. We are now in the most remote key possible, and Beethoven has to find some way of getting back home, which he does by reducing the main theme to the tiniest possible fragment, to nothing but its opening 3 notes. Now you remember, the tune went like this. He reduces it to nothing but the first 3 notes. And he tries it everywhere. Maybe here, constantly trying it, but these are just the first 3 notes of the theme. Here he is trying to find his way back home with just 3 notes of the theme. Here, maybe here, maybe with French horns. And this leads to the passage that caused the composer Carl Maria von Weber to say that Beethoven was ripe for the madhouse. This is a truly extraordinary passage that predates Philip Glass and the Minimalists by about 150 years. He takes the opening measure of that vivace, transforms it into this figure in the low strings, and then he repeats it identically over and over again for 22 measures. I was going to play all 22 for you, but I'll just give you 8 to give you the idea. Over and over again. Philip Glass. 22 measures of that. Above this, the woodwinds and the brass play nothing but our famous E for 22 measures as the violins trace out simple, elementary, E-centered figures, and the tension builds unbearably as we desperately want this to resolve like this. A little rhythm, add instruments. A little more rhythm, faster, building, finally, no resolution yet, trade-offs. Still no resolution. Still waiting. Finally, resolve. Horns. No matter what happens, we're going to keep that take for the French horns for the radio. Now, as remarkable as the first movement of the symphony is, it was the second movement that was actually encored at the premiere. So by the way, clearly people clapped between movements in Beethoven's day, or there's nowhere that a middle movement could possibly otherwise have been encored. This movement became so famous in the decades following the premiere that it was often inserted into other Beethoven symphonies to replace their actual slow movements. Now, the movement's a fantastic example of Beethoven's ability to build a huge monumental world out of the humblest of materials, and the form of the movement is utterly unique. Now, the movement both begins and ends with a single, strange, unstable, unresolved chord scored for nothing but woodwinds and horns like this. This single, sustained, unresolved chord serves as a kind of framing device for the entire movement. It both begins and ends the entire movement, and since it never resolves, in a way, it's as if the whole movement is a kind of a dream between two parentheses. An extraordinary way to begin a movement. Now, without resolution, this mysterious chord is followed by a truly pitiful theme that is so absurdly unmelodic that it's hardly even a theme at all. It sounds more like a sketch for a theme than an actual theme. Mozart would have rolled over in his grave. Here's the opening theme. Fantastic theme. Okay, now, this is so elementary and uninteresting that it's barely a theme at all. Now, repeating an E 12 times is not exactly how you begin a great melody. However, repeating the same note 12 times makes the little rising scale that follows extremely noticeable. Whoa, big news. But then back to the repetition. Now, the theme in classic Beethoven fashion is dominated by a single rhythm, just a long, short, short, long, long. And there are only two ideas in the whole theme. It's either that rhythm on a repeated note or that rhythm on the little rising scale. Let's follow it out. First, it's on the repeated note. Same rhythm repeated, single note. The little rising scale. Back to the repeated note. Then the same rising scale here. The rising scale lower. Back to the repeated note. And then the rising scale to end. And then there's a fantastic pianissimo echo of the last half of the tune that sounds like some kind of a whispered secret. Now, the movement starts like an absolutely traditional theme and variation movement. You've just heard the theme very clear. Variation 1 adds a new, deeply expressive counter melody in the viola and cello underneath our original skeleton of a melody. And now, after that bare bones melody of the beginning, it sounds unbelievably melodic, as if in a way we are discovering melody for the first time. Now, in Variation 1, and in all the variations, there are three elements. There's our original theme, there's the new counter melody that you're about to hear, and then there's a bass line. You are literally watching Beethoven build up his universe from the most basic building blocks imaginable. In Variation 1, the original theme is in the second violins over here, the new counter melody is in violas and half the cello, and a bass line underneath. Here's Variation 1. New counter melody, original. There the tune. This is the new counter melody. This is the exact original melody there. Beethoven follows this variation with two more utterly clear variations. In textbook fashion, each variation has the original theme, and that little counter melody rise one octave higher. So in the second variation, it started like this. Then the next one up here, third variation up here. While the accompaniment moves faster rhythmically, the dynamic level gets louder, and more instruments get added, giving the entire section a dramatic arc and a shape. 4 measures of each variation will give you the basic idea. Here's the first 4 measures of variation 2. Now, the original tune is over here, the counter melody is over here, and the accompaniment is moving a little faster rhythmically like this. 4 measures of variation 2. And here's the first 4 measures of variation 3 with the full orchestra. This is the climax of the whole section. Now the original theme is in the winds, and the counter melodies in violin 1 over here. Having reached a climax in the middle of the third variation, the funeral procession, so to speak, recedes into the distance, and the music fades away as if we're going to simply end the movement like this. Take just that last measure, but then suddenly switch to major, and what's this doing in the piece? Suddenly, right in the middle of what we were absolutely sure was a traditional theme and variation, straightforward movement, the somber minor key gloom lifts. We find ourselves in a major key and in some kind of a pastoral dream, something that sounds like a trio from a minuet and trio, leaving our supposed theme and variations movement behind like some kind of distant memory. Now, the trio runs through its leisurely course as we try to figure out what kind of piece this is, changes keys, but then in a classic Beethoven brutal show the plumbing moment, he ends that pastoral dream by abruptly jerking the music back to a minor key, back to our theme and variations movement, a 4th variation, as if that little trio, that pastoral dream that we just heard, had never happened. So here's the end of the pastoral dream. Echo in the bassoon. But then suddenly, you see it happen. Nothing's hidden. And back, variation 4. Original tune, counter melody. Suddenly, a 4th variation, and now the trio has been left behind like a distant memory. Now, this 4th variation proceeds utterly normally. Now we've forgotten all about our trio, but instead of ending, Beethoven uses the variation's last phrase to transition shockingly to a pianissimo fugue, a 5th variation based on the tiniest possible fragment of our original theme. Here's the ending of the 4th variation, and then we find ourselves in the middle of a fugue. Suddenly, fugue. An amazing moment. Now, for non-musicians, in a fugue, the main theme is called the subject, and the subject here is based on the only melodic fragment in that completely unmelodic theme. I mean, you can't make a fugue out of this. So he takes the only melodic fragment, the little rising scale, that's the first bar of the fugue subject, then he starts to repeat it higher. An exact copy would have been, but he changes the end. That's our fugue subject. Now, again, for non-musicians, the melody that plays against the fugue subject is called the counter subject, and here this one comes straight out of a textbook. If your fugue subject is in slow notes, make your counter subject in fast notes. Now, this magnificent short fugue, who would have ever guessed that that bare bones theme contained this as a possibility, builds to an enormous climax and a return of our opening theme, now fortissimo with the full orchestra, clearly, we think, a final sixth variation that's going to end this bizarre movement. Now you're going to hear the theme, the original theme here in the strings, and in the brass, the counter subject from the fugue in the woodwinds. We're ready to end, but uh-oh. Unbelievable, right? The trio comes back again. At this point, we have absolutely no idea how or even if this movement will ever end, but nothing has prepared us for its remarkable conclusion. This trio breaks off, and we get one final variation on the original bare bones theme, without counter melody or accompaniment rhythm whatsoever, with each two-bar fragment of the theme passed to a different instrumental group like this. Clarinets, oboe, bassoons and horn, strings. And finally, the movement ends as enigmatically as it began. Beethoven takes the final four notes of the theme, remember, just the rising scale, puts it down low in the bass and cello, and overlaps four statements of it, with each one beginning before the previous one finishes, with the final one blending into that mysterious, unstable, unresolved horn and woodwind chord which began the movement. A unique movement bookended by these two mysterious chords which never resolve. In a way, the movement is finished, done or ended, yet somehow poetically incomplete. Here's the ending of the movement. Last four notes from the theme. Down here, 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 overlap. The mysterious chord, and it's done. An extraordinary ending to a movement. Now, at some point in Beethoven's career, he reinvents nearly every aspect of classical period style, and some of his most radical reinventions occur in what was traditionally the most simple, conservative movement of any classical period symphony, the minuet and trio. Minuet and trio was as close to a fixed form as the classical period ever came. Like a sonnet or a haiku, the externals of the form were fixed, and audiences knew what to expect. They expected to hear a movement in three overall sections. The first section, called the minuet, would be in two parts, with both parts repeated. The middle section, called the trio, would also be in two parts, with both parts repeated. And then the minuet would be played through one more time without repeats. So minuet, trio, minuet, ABA for short. Since the minuet was, of course, originally something you danced to, audiences expected a danceable tempo with three moderately quick beats to the bar, something like this tempo in a Haydn symphony minuet. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, or the same tempo in a Mozart-Hafner minuet. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1. Here's what the main theme of Beethoven's 7th Symphony scherzo would have sounded like at that tempo. But here's what that sounds like at his breakneck tempo. A little bit different. Now, the tiny two-measure introduction that jolts us into the piece is actually made special by two tiny details that make the music so explosive. Instead of beginning with just a simple arpeggio, he adds two little quick notes before the beat. to make the music less smooth and more abrupt. And then instead of a normal accompaniment simply on the beat, he has the accompaniment play on the upbeat as well, which at tempo literally catapults the listener into the piece. Now, the tune that follows is a simple descending scale with 2 repeated notes at the beginning of each measure, what I'll call repeat and repeat and repeat and stop. Then the same thing higher, repeat and repeat and repeat and stop. But he immediately begins to develop this, taking nothing more than the first 3 notes of repeat and, putting them down here, repeat and changing the second bar with a 2-note side. So instead of, now we get repeat and sigh. Repeat and sigh. You only get 1 repeat, so you better listen quickly. And then once we've got the sigh, he says, what if I transpose the sigh? Transpose for non-musicians just means started on a different note. So repeat and sigh, just work with the sigh. Sigh, sigh. We've changed keys, and now an explosive closing idea with a trill, trill. And we finish with an arpeggio. Now, we started in the key of F. Non-musicians, you don't have to know names of notes, just think of it as a label. We started in the key of F, get this in your ear. But 10 seconds later, by the end of the first phrase, we're already in the key of A, a different key. It's not just the actual speed of the music that makes this so exciting, it's the speed of the musical thought. Now, however extraordinary this first phrase is, it's the second phrase that pushes the scherzo to unheard of places, as Beethoven begins to develop the tiniest fragments of this first phrase in unprecedented ways. No fragment is too insignificant to be worked with. Now, he first takes nothing but the opening 3 notes, which we thought was just an introduction. He takes just the first 3 notes, and he transposes it, and then passes that idea through the parts. Then he takes our phrase, the repeat and sigh, transposes that phrase as well. Repeat and sigh. Repeat and sigh, then just the sigh. Sigh, sigh. Now he goes nuts with sigh, transposing it everywhere in sight. Sigh, sigh, sigh. Do it down here as well. Sigh, sigh, sigh. And then we finished with the opening 3 notes, which has now become key material in the piece. Suddenly that has generated all this. Let's see if you can hear that going by at supersonic speed. Repeat and sigh, sigh, sigh here, sigh here. Opening 3 notes. Truly extraordinary stuff. Now, Beethoven then works with all of this material as if this were a full-fledged first movement, a full-fledged sonata movement, with a first theme, a second theme, a recapitulation, vastly expanding the dimensions of a classical period scherzo. Scherzo is just a faster minuet. And we even get a Haydn-esque false return, which simply means a return of the opening theme in the wrong key. Finally, the opening returns in the right key in another classic example of Beethovenian transformation. Now, here was the original soft piano version. This was delicate and safe. Here's the transformed fortissimo full orchestra version, followed by variation. Now, the scherzo portion of the movement ends by hammering away at the opening 3 notes of the movement over and over again till we're left with nothing but the whole orchestra holding a single note, the A that's the key to the entire movement. Now, that second section repeats. We come to this unison A a second time, and now with an utter sense of rightness, it resolves into the trio, the middle section of the movement, like this. So now you're hearing the opening 3 notes of the movement over and over again, hammering into your brain. Trio. Now, though trios are traditionally the simplest part of any classical period symphony, this trio pushes simplicity to unbelievably new levels. The next 85 measures are essentially nothing but a single note. Our famous A is essentially held for 85 straight measures for all but the final 2 measures of the trio. Above this, the only other, quote, idea or theme is so primitive and rudimentary that it's almost ridiculous to call it a theme. All it is a note with a dip and then back to the note, which I'll call note and back. Note and back. Again, it's important to learn this technical vocabulary. Now, so the whole tune is nothing other than note and back, a little connector, and then the same thing higher. Note and back, note and back. That's it. Yet even this simple material can be transformed as once again this soft piano opening version ultimately returns transformed fortissimo by the whole orchestra. Here was the original. Now it becomes this. That's transformation. Now, then our ridiculously simple motive, note and back, goes down to the second horn really low down here. And back. Note and back, and ultimately it magically becomes transposed to become note and back, to switch keys to return to the opening section like this. So listen for second horn down low. Note and back. Note and back. We get softer, all note and back. Transpose it. Note and back. As we've seen, Beethoven is enormously expanding the proportions, the size, and the scope of a classical period scherzo, but he actually expands the size in one other way as well. Traditionally, as I mentioned, scherzos were in 3 parts. The scherzo, then the trio in the middle, and then a return to the scherzo played without repeats, scherzo, trio, scherzo. But to expand the form, Beethoven here and in other of his middle period works doubles the size of the form, creating what music theorists call a double repeating scherzo. Now with 5 sections instead of 3. Scherzo, trio, scherzo, extra repeat of the trio, extra repeat of the scherzo, 5 sections. And by now, Beethoven's penchant for these double repeating scherzos was well known, and this allows him to create one final Beethovenian joke. He comes to the end of our 3rd repeat of the scherzo. This is the extra repeat of the scherzo, which should finally end this enormous double repeating movement. He gets to our famous held A, but then instead of ending, he astonishingly starts a 3rd repeat of the trio, as if he forgot that the piece was supposed to end, and as if it might go on forever, simply alternating scherzo, trio, ad infinitum. But after 2 bars of the trio, just as the audience is about to walk out in protest, our little note and back figure turns to minor, and 5 swift bars say, "Just kidding," and end the movement, cue Beethoven laughing hysterically. So here's the ending of the 3rd scherzo section, the extra repeat of the scherzo. We're going, oh no, not again. Yes, we do. But make it minor. Just kidding. Done. Tchaikovsky called the finale of this symphony, quote, a whole series of images, full of unrestrained joy, full of bliss and pleasure of life. Other commentators describe it as, quote, aggressive vitality, elemental fury unleashed, and as, quote, drawing on the deepest primeval sources of pure energy. That's how they talked in the 19th century. And there's no doubt that the primary source of this vitality, elemental fury, and pure energy is really pure rhythm. Though the opening of this movement might seem to contain themes and melodies, for Beethoven they're all fundamentally rhythms. Here's the incredibly propulsive opening of this 4th movement. scherzo, the fourth movement begins with a brief call to attention or fanfare that sounds like it's going to be nothing more than an introduction. Let the simple rhythmic repeated note idea, what I'm going to call the same note, is actually going to turn out to be one of the key ideas in the entire piece, and not just an introduction. Similarly, the three other ideas in this opening that are going to become crucial to the rest of the movement are really all about rhythm and not pitch. What sounds like our opening tune is really about two different rhythms for Beethoven. The first one I'll call dum-bugga-dugga-dugga, then the same idea higher, dum-bugga-dugga-dugga, back to the original one, dum-bugga-dugga-dugga, and then the one heroic leap, which we call dia-dum. That's it. Dum-bugga-dugga-dugga and dia-dum are the only ones. And finally, though this could not sound less interesting or less important, the simple bass rhythm underneath the tune, which is just an upbeat and a downbeat, that I'm going to call and one, and one, and one, and later and one, and one, and one, will also turn out to be a crucial source of material as well. Rhythm, not pitch, is the key to the movement and Beethoven's idea of connection. Now, though several other ideas make appearances in this exposition, the development works with those opening four rhythms in remarkable ways. It begins as if it's going to simply repeat the main theme in a new key, but instead he focuses on that heroic leap, on the dia-dum, to brutally halt the piece's forward momentum and then abruptly divert the main theme first to a minor key and then to a remote one. So it starts off, and you think you know what's going to happen next, but dia-dum stops everything. Da-da-da. Now in a minor key, dia-dum takes over. Dia-dum. Now faster, in a third key. Once the piece's elements have become familiar to the listener, Beethoven's willingness to separate their rhythmic essence from their melodic shape, to separate their rhythms from their notes, generates unprecedented kinds of musical connections. As we saw, perhaps the least interesting element in that opening was that simple fanfare, the same note, the same note. The next least interesting element was that simple upbeat and a downbeat in the bass, and one, and one, and one. I mean, it doesn't get more banal than the same note, and one, and one. But Beethoven now astonishingly creates the next 41 measures out of nothing but those two rhythms. Every single measure is some new combination of and one or the same note. The pitches change constantly and are almost irrelevant. It's those two rhythms that connect everything. We start off hearing and one in the violins, and one, and one, and one, and one, while we hear the same note in the woodwinds. The same note, the same note. Everything you're going to hear in the next 41 measures is a combination of and one and the same note. And one, to the woodwinds, and one, da-da-da, and back, and one, all at one, and one. All at once and the same notes. All made out of those two rhythms. After all the important music returns in the recapitulation, the final section of the movement, the coda, in astonishing fashion, begins far away from home tonally, and it delays returning to the home chord for 102 thrilling measures, building up almost unbearable tension. As I mentioned earlier, Beethoven was willing to make listeners wait for arrivals and resolutions longer than any previous composer in history. Though classical period codas were traditionally pretty short and really did nothing much more than provide balance and closure, Beethoven's codas are expansive and often become one of the most intensely dramatic sections of the entire work. Here, the coda begins in a minor key, far away from home, with that key figure from the main theme, dum-bugga-dugga-dugga, dum-bugga-dugga-dugga, passed through the instruments one by one like this. From the bottom up. And then in one of the most thrilling passages of the entire piece, which I am going to save for the performance after intermission, since you should only hear it once, the music desperately searches for a key for 22 measures as the bass gradually gets lower and lower and lower. Finally, it pauses one step from home on what musicians call the dominant. If this is home, this is what we call the dominant, one step away from going to home, where in stunning, again, Philip Glass-like fashion, the lower strings grind away for 20 measures on the same two notes. Ugly, over and over again, 20 measures on the same two notes as the main theme's opening figure rises higher and higher, getting louder and louder. The opening fanfare and the shrieking horns ultimately return, but it's still over that grinding bass which refuses to resolve. Nothing can get that bass line to resolve. So you're going to be paying attention up here, but pay attention to da-da-da-da over and over in the bass, which refuses to resolve. Trade-off. Still it hasn't resolved. Horns come back. Still it's not resolved. Even with the return of that opening material, Beethoven refuses to resolve that grinding bass line for another 34 thrilling measures. Both the tension and the volume rise to the very first ever triple F marking that Beethoven ever wrote in a symphony. For non-musicians, one F means forte, loud. Two Fs, fortissimo, means very loud, still somewhat common. Three Fs, fortissimo, means unprecedentedly loud. But once the climax is reached and Beethoven finally resolves that droning bass, the ending comes swiftly, in a single phrase, finishing with that opening fanfare that began it all. Here's that final crescendo to Beethoven's first ever triple F marking, and then the resolution and the ending. Connect, only connect, wrote E.M. Forster, and he might well have been describing Beethoven's entire compositional approach. As early as 1829, the brilliant critic A.B. Marx already sensed that connectedness and relatedness were at the heart of what Beethoven's music was all about, when he proposed that, quote, Beethoven composed each of his works according to a fundamental idea that underpinned the connectedness, unity, and harmony of its apparently discordant features. You know, Beethoven's compositional technique says, in essence, we look at the surface of things and we see difference. But the differences that separate us are superficial and illusory. What's fundamental is what is the same. And finding that connectedness and relatedness behind difference has become the principal work of the composition. And not only the principal work of the composition, but, since 1776, I might say, the principal work of America as well. If you look at the back of a dollar bill, right above the bald eagle are the words of the Great Seal of the United States, E pluribus unum, out of many, one. The original meaning, of course, referred to the attempt to create, out of many states, one country. But as our country becomes more polarized, divided, and multicultural every day, with a variety of peoples that the founders could never have envisaged, the attempt to truly fulfill the mission of the Great Seal, to create out of many one, becomes more and more challenging. To look like Beethoven, not at what separates us, but what connects us. Not what divides and differentiates us, but what unites us. Stravinsky says in a profound quotation that goes far beyond music, he says, variety is easy to produce. Unity, far more difficult. Connect, only connect. Out of many, one. Beethoven's challenge remains our challenge today. And like so many challenges in life, the solution begins with listening. Thank you so much and enjoy the performance.